I'm the Vice President of Research and Strategy here at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome so many of you to this public event on Canada-ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations Partnership at a Pivotal Time. It's great to see all of you in person. Special welcome to Senator Austin, to members of the Consular Corps, to our partners in West Vancouver, as well as obviously to colleagues from APFC, not least of all our President and CEO, Jeff Nankerville, who's here as well. It's also a pleasure, please come on in. It's also a pleasure to welcome many folks online. So this event is very much on the record, is being live streamed across Canada and the world, and a recording from it will be available for promotion later on. We're meeting at a time when Canada, like so many others, is trying to diversify its economic and security partnerships, reduce over-reliance on the US in our case. And of course, when we talk about diversification of partnerships, ASEAN, Southeast Asia is a critical part of the world to look at. As part of our Indo-Pacific strategy, which was adopted almost 3 years ago, Canadian government recognized the significance of this region, both in terms of its economic potential, but also in terms of its future, in terms of trade, innovation, digital economy, and so forth. In the last 3 years, I'm happy to note that we've seen quite an expansion of Canadian presence in the region. So just a few examples of that. Obviously, we have an Agriculture and Food Security Office in Manila. We have the Export Development Canada's office in Jakarta. We have FinDev in Singapore. We have our own Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada regional office, now fully operational in Singapore as well. We have envoys for the Indo-Pacific strategy in Tokyo, but also on trade and economic relations in the name of Paul Topol in the region in Southeast Asia, until recently in Jakarta and now in Singapore. So we definitely have a lot more Canadian presence in the region, showcasing that we want to engage. We want Canada to be seen as a reliable partner. We see the opportunities, but also the challenges, right? So we can talk about the economic dynamism, the growing middle class, 700 million people, which basically together is the third largest after China and European Union in terms of population and potential market for Canadian investment, trade, and goods, and so forth. But there's also geopolitical tensions. This region sits at the heart of the US-China strategic competition, very familiar with how to manage the two great powers, but of course now we're seeing so much disruption and so much uncertainty that's also impacting the region. There are hotspots and flashpoints in the region as well, so South China Sea, of course, as well as Taiwan Strait. So the region has to also take care of traditional security issues, but also a lot of emerging security threats around transnational crime, around cybersecurity, IP theft, all of those things, areas, non-traditional security areas where Canada has also been engaged. So in other words, the region is dynamic. And Canada has opportunities to engage not just from a perspective of economic and trade relations, which is obviously critical, but also as a reliable partner when it comes to peace and stability in the region as well. I think in Canada, it would be fair to say that since our new government has taken the lead, a lot of attention has been on the US and on Europe. A lot of travel to Europe, but this fall promises to represent a bit of a change. We are planning to have our Prime Minister and senior ministers travel to the region for the ASEAN Leaders Summit in Malaysia in KL, as well as APAC in South Korea later in the month, which will provide an opportunity for the government to speak directly with the audiences in the region about Canada's continued engagement. So we kind of made the pivot, if you will, through the Indo-Pacific strategy 3 years ago. Now there's going to be a lot of questions about what does that engagement look like in the current global environment, in the environment that we find ourselves both with the US, but also obviously fragmentation of the global trading environment, a return of protectionism, economic nationalism. What does this mean for Canada-ASEAN relations? Because as we look around the world where everybody else is kind of becoming more protectionist, more fragmented, in ASEAN, we're still seeing optimism for integration. We're still seeing desire to have free trade agreements, including with Canada. We're negotiating an ASEAN-Canada FTA right now. So, and traditionally, that has been an area of convergence between Canada and ASEAN, this commitment to multilateralism, this commitment to rules-based trade, to integration, to globalization, if you will, right? So I think the region will be listening to what messages come out of certainly our Prime Minister, but also other senior officials who will be engaging in the region. Minister Anand was the first person from this administration to visit the region in July. She was in Malaysia for the ASEAN ministerial meeting and very much delivered a message of continued prioritization of the region. Sort of if you listen to the government, it's Europe and Indo-Pacific as kind of the two regional priorities. She focused on energy security in particular, so we'll be speaking about that a little bit, as well as food security, and then kind of signaled that there is a desire to finish the FTA as soon as possible. Now, it looks like the end of the year is not realistic, so we're kind of looking at the middle of next year for finalization of that agreement. In addition to kind of October being a critical moment for Canada's engagement in the region, we're also looking at expanding our ASEAN-Canada action plan. So there's ASEAN and Canada have a strategic partnership that was adopted 2 years ago. We also have a 5-year action plan that has been guiding what we do together with the 10 nations of ASEAN. That 5-year plan is due to be renewed at the end of this year. So I think the moment is also quite right for us to think of specific ways in which we will be changing, updating, and reprioritizing what we're doing in the region, both with the whole of ASEAN as well as with individual partners. Indonesia, the most populous country in the region, we now have finalized a free trade agreement, so how can we actually fully utilize it? That's a question, as well as obviously with countries like Malaysia, Philippines, and so forth. So we're meeting at a timely moment, which is partly why I think we have such a full room and such a distinguished room of experts who I hope we will be engaging with. In terms of how we will proceed, we have 3 distinguished speakers who will kick off the discussion. Then we'll have a moderated session, and then the final 30 minutes will be dedicated to a conversation with all of you for your comments, for your questions. As I mentioned, we'll try to be as practical as possible in terms of how can we actually do more to be able to advance both our prosperity, but also to be seen as a real partner to the region. So in terms of our speakers, I am delighted to first introduce Trisha Yeo, who is a senior fellow with us, but until recently was the CEO and president of IDEAS, which is an organization based in Malaysia. She's now also an adjunct professor. She's a visiting fellow here with us, as I mentioned, and has been in Vancouver for about a week, attending various meetings and conferences. We're absolutely thrilled that her final stop in Vancouver is at Asia Pacific Foundation for this event. And of course, Trisha will be speaking from a perspective of Malaysia, which is the current chair of ASEAN. She's written extensively on this topic, including for us. So if you don't hear enough, you can also look at her work on our website. Her piece from earlier this spring on kind of Malaysia's priorities is really particularly excellent. Then we have Richard Heydarian, who is a visiting Indo-Pacific visiting scholar with Asia Pacific Foundation with us. He's our second such fellow under this new program. And Richard and I have just spent a week traveling across Canada. So we were in Winnipeg together, in Manitoba, in Ottawa for a few days, where Richard was able to speak to universities, to media, as well as to government officials on Canada-Philippines relations in particular, but also more broadly sort of security dynamics in the region. Richard is a political scientist, a scholar, but he's also an influencer, someone who now has a very large public presence through his podcasts and YouTube channels. Millions of people tune in on a weekly basis to his programming in the region. So we were really excited to have such an influential commentator on Southeast Asian geopolitics, on South China Sea, China dynamics, as well as obviously Philippines foreign policy and domestic policy. Like I said, he's spent a week already here, so has heard plenty about Canada and Canada's engagement with the region, and we're hoping for his final stop, he can also reflect a little bit on that in our conversation today. And finally, from a Canadian perspective, and of course I should also note that Philippines will be the chair of ASEAN next year, so we're kind of nicely have the current chair and the next year's chair to set an agenda for the year ahead. And to anchor us in a Canadian perspective, we're absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Kai Oswald, who is very well known to everybody here in Vancouver. He's a professor at UBC, both in the political science and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. He obviously is a Southeast Asia specialist, travels a lot to the region, is very familiar to folks, especially in Malaysia, Indonesia, Myanmar. He's also a senior fellow with us and has written extensively, including on what Canada should be doing in Myanmar, which I think is really interesting, and obviously both Malaysia and Philippines care a great deal about that crisis in the context of their chairmanship. So those are our speakers. As I mentioned, I'll first turn to you, Tricia, to so each speaker will offer about 7 to 10 minutes, kind of scene setter comments, and then we'll do moderated discussion. So with that, again, thank you so much for being here, and Tricia, the floor is yours.
A very good morning to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Selamat pagi. For those who understand it, that's Malay for good morning, as I am coming from Malaysia. Just like to say thank you, first of all, to the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, especially to Veena, who has been facilitating all of this, and as well as to Jeff, who I recently met. I am only going to have 7 to 10 minutes in this first initial breeze through, as I would say, of an overall perspective of Malaysia's chairmanship, and then I hope to get into more detail in the discussion portion. So I'll just have 4 very quick sections of my initial intervention. I'm going to talk about what the current situation looks like, a brief ASEAN recap, 2025, what we've done, what we've achieved, and then small opportunities for Canada, which I think we're going to talk more about, and then looking ahead into the next year as well. So I think we all know that 2025 was a big year for many reasons. ASEAN, like all the other regions, like all the other countries, were caught off guard by Liberation Day, and this already happened in the first few months. The eventual negotiations brought our tariffs down to, and I'm just going to list it very quickly, Myanmar and Laos were the highest at 40%, Vietnam 20%, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Cambodia 19%. In fact, the Philippines was the only one that saw its tariff increase, so that might be interesting for Richard to comment on. Brunei 25%, and then Singapore 10%. ASEAN has always struggled to give meaning to what the region actually means and stands for. It's not like other regional bodies like the EU. In fact, prior to this year, I think there were already a lot of questions swirling around as to the efficacy of ASEAN. Is it effective? Is it actually achieving anything? But this year, I think you saw something different. You saw a sense of unity against the odds. There was a great attempt for negotiating together. Ultimately, of course, many countries still negotiated separately with the White House. But there was a renewed sense of urgency. You saw a lot of consolidation, a lot of combined press statements, and I think most importantly, a reaffirmation to this rule-based international order. But this is the dilemma, and I'll come to the recap shortly. The dilemma is that despite trying to operate as an integrated region, yet single countries are still individually worried about things like dumping from China, cheap goods. Malaysia itself is right now trying to revise its anti-dumping laws in Parliament, which economists may actually say could be a mistake because ultimately actually consumers may stand to benefit from cheap goods. So there's a lot of discussion, a lot of debate at the moment because I think there are 2 different strategies that could be pursued. On the one hand, you talk about regional supply chains and integration, but on the other hand, there's also intra-regional competition. So understand that many of the countries within ASEAN are also producing goods that are very similar to each other, precisely because of the integration of these regional supply chains. And then the last statistic on this section. So the Chinese exports to ASEAN have actually increased 22.5% year on year. And this corresponds with ASEAN's exports to the US decreasing by about 30%. So in a sense, China has, through its charm offensive, President Xi Jinping did come out to visit Malaysia. It was planned beforehand, but this was very timely for China, definitely to woo relationships within ASEAN. Okay, second part of my intervention, really quick ASEAN recap 2025. So Malaysia was the chair this year, and the theme was sustainability and inclusivity. I think just 4 broad areas that a lot of emphasis was on. We've got economic integration and trade facilitation. We've always tried to push for this ASEAN economic community, but as I said, I think it's this year that we see a lot more traction, and there's a need, there's a drive towards regional integration. Reducing non-tariff barriers, as Veena mentioned, is a priority, and strengthening our supply chains. The second big area has been on digital economy. There's a real race to not just finalizing, but also implementing, and you'll see a lot of this in the next October summit, the Digital Economic Framework Agreement, DEFA, and trying to have a unified digital market by 2030, including common standards and cross-border data flows. The third big area is around sustainability and green transition, trying to push for regional cooperation on renewable energy, sustainable finance, and the fourth big area would be on food security and supply chain resilience, as also mentioned earlier. So some key things that were done in the first ASEAN summit earlier this year, you have things like the KL Declaration or the ASEAN Community 2045, our shared future. In the coming October summit, you're going to see some of those things maybe being pulled, and to see how this aligns with the current theme this year. One major achievement that at least I believe Malaysia as chair was very proud of was having the inaugural ASEAN GCC China Summit. So ASEAN and GCC, the Gulf nations essentially have had versions of this summit in the past, but it's the first time that China has joined in the fold. And some of the priorities include finance and so on. Something else would be China actually really wants to see the upgrade of the China-ASEAN FTA, and they want to see it in the areas of agriculture and the digital economy, which you're going to hear again and again, as well as in pharmaceuticals. So I think just again to emphasize how key China sees its relationship with ASEAN moving forward. Essentially, China does acknowledge that it needs ASEAN's relationship, and vice versa, right? ASEAN is also keen to deepen these relationships, not just with China, but also with India. So a lot of talk around the upgrading of these FTAs, as well as the ATIGA, right? The ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement. On non-trade issues, I think this year we're going to see Timor-Leste joining the ASEAN fold, and this is significant in many ways. It's been a long time coming, so you'll see a lot of that being celebrated in October. And another thing that Malaysia is quite proud of course, would be to having negotiate the ceasefire between Cambodia and Thailand. Although there might be some disagreement as to the role played by Malaysia. Yeah, I got a little bit of feedback on that in a recent talk I gave to a group of ambassadors in Malaysia. But nevertheless, so I mean, the key question is, what role did ASEAN play in that? Like, could it have been negotiated and brokered without ASEAN? I believe that the answer is no. I think that ASEAN is still a minimum necessary platform that was important to bring the different players together. And another question would have been, if it was not Malaysia, could it have been negotiated? I'd like to see it as, again, the answer being that Malaysia was in a very good position to negotiate that, given where it stands. Like if it was a more minor country like Laos, of course, the outcomes might have been very different. And then, of course, priorities given to Myanmar. I would say South China Sea has been not as great a priority as Myanmar. And I think this is really where the conversation gets very interesting, because you're looking ahead to where the Philippines comes in next year. Okay, moving very quickly forward, I think opportunities for Canada, and I believe that Kai will be going more into this as well. So I think that my big message here is that yes, there are a lot of trade and economic opportunities, and these are already currently being explored. There's a lot of trade facilitation. You've come out to Southeast Asia, to Malaysia, to Singapore. APF has set up in Singapore as well. But I think the strong message and the story that Canada may want to sell more is that yes, it's an important trading partner, but it's more than just an important trading partner. The story about culture, about the people-to-people relationship, that hasn't come out as strongly, and this is a huge opportunity that Canada can actually take huge advantage of at a time when it wants to significantly differentiate itself and sufficiently differentiate itself from the US and what the image is to Southeast Asians. I would say generally Southeast Asians actually have a good image of Canada, but it's also a rather hollow image, right? It's an image that does not have substantive content, and that's where that substance can really be driven from now on. On the trade matters, Canada is the signatory of the CPTPP as Malaysia, so all these opportunities, especially around the halal market, I think are very relevant, not just for Malaysia, but for Indonesia. You're talking about goods like beef, like dairy, even other products like wheat. I would say Canada's already investing into ASEAN in a big way, like in the Philippines, in Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam. But the question is, do you do that individually, or do you pitch it as a sort of regional investment, right? Aligning with ASEAN's objectives itself. We will talk more about the FTA with ASEAN shortly, the Canada-ASEAN FTA, but yeah, suffice to say, there are a lot of great economic benefits that stand to be gained, increase exports to ASEAN by about 2 to 3 billion US dollars. One other idea would be plugging into ASEAN's existing supply chains. So ASEAN is really investing big in the areas of semiconductors. This is a strength that many of the Southeast Asian countries have. So I mentioned halal already, and then of course Islamic finance, because again, Indonesia and Malaysia, Indonesia being the largest country in terms of population of ASEAN. And the other big one would be SMEs. And I know APF has done great work on this. I'm an advisor on one of the projects that APF is doing. Southeast Asia is full of small, not just even small or medium, like micro enterprises, right? These represent the beating heart of Southeast Asia. But they are also very local. So the challenge has always been for them to break out of the domestic economy. They need a lot of help, especially on the digitalization front. The issues that we're currently dealing with include things like cybersecurity risks. They don't have any idea how to navigate that. They don't have the capacity nor the skill sets. So I think this is where Canada can really come in. I know I don't have much time. I'll conclude really quickly. So just looking ahead, what do we expect to see in the October ASEAN Summit? So there's a lot of activities going on. If any of you are in the private sector, I think it would be great for you to come out. I think the focus will be on the private sector. So there's also the ASEAN Business and Investment Summit taking place around, plus all these other leadership summits. I just got off the phone yesterday with MasterCard, who's actually hosting its inaugural ASEAN, what do they call it, Global Inclusive Growth Summit. And they're going to be doing this for the next 3 years and really trying to show the role and presence of private sector in ASEAN. And I'm glad that the attention is being refocused here. For the ASEAN Summit, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia has said the focus will be on the economy, on inter-ASEAN trade, cross-border investments, the energy grid, and connectivity. It'll be a really interesting summit. Not sure how the streets of KL will be, but we're expecting to receive President Trump, Putin, and not Xi Jinping. So I think the verdict is out that they're not going to be sending him, but probably just the premier. But still, with these world leaders at the foot of Kuala Lumpur, I expect there'll be a lot of traffic, first of all, and possibly also some protests, right? Because I think the US president will be coming in at a time not just in reflection of Liberation Day tariffs, but also Malaysia in particular's position around what's happening in the Middle East. So October will be a very tricky time to, but please do still consider coming to Kuala Lumpur then, despite what I just said. Malaysia also is trying to host the RCEP summit. So that's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which has been important to us. And I think I'll just say one last thing about the CPTPP, which is that China also wants to participate in the CPTPP, which is going to be, I think, I think the other member countries of CPTPP are kind of put in a difficult position because the CPTPP was actually initiated as an economic and trade partnership that was meant to exclude China. But as you know, with the US being out of it, then if China can meet the very high standards to begin with, so if it can meet those standards, what then do the other member states decide on? And also bearing in mind that Taiwan also would like to join the CPTPP. And of course, from a member state, in Malaysia myself, I would argue that we stand to gain if both China and Taiwan come and have accession formally. Okay, my conclusion is that we have this disruption of this multilateral international rules-based order currently. I think all the panelists will agree that we need our new trading partners to fully commit. The Southeast Asian countries now have always been caught in a dilemma, and you'll hear a lot of terms about ASEAN centrality, but also strategic neutrality. In reality, Southeast Asia cannot afford to pick sides, and we often feel as if we are forced to. We've always asked that question, if push comes to shove, who would we choose, US or China? The IC's Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore has a very good and helpful survey that takes place each year, and you'll find that it changes year on year. So in 1 year, you'll see Southeast Asian, the population of Southeast Asian nations saying China, the other one would say US, so it's most recently the US, but the previous year it was China. So I think you can see that that reflects our sentiment, that we don't like being forced to choose, and we, in reality, have to be able to work with all sides. We don't like this potential future of complete bifurcation, right? And we see that happening, especially in the digital space. And we want to avoid that happening as much as possible because we are so deeply integrated into these regional and then also international supply chains. So the story from Canada, I think, like I said earlier on, it has to be seen as more than just a trade partner. It has to also be seen as supporters of the ASEAN vision and ASEAN objectives. And how do you go about doing that? I think everything that the APF does is brilliant. It contributes to this story of being a reliable partner in an uncertain world. And if we can continue increasing trade facilitation, increasing the many trade offices in Southeast Asia, and hopefully you will also see that this benefits Canada not just from a trade perspective, but it also builds national resilience and societal and private sector resilience for Canada itself. So I would see it as a win-win overall. I will end here and look forward to interaction later. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Trisha. In 10 minutes, you did quite a tour of both what has happened already, but also what to look forward to in October. I think your message that it's not enough just to be seen as a reliable trading partner, that we also need to be seen as a partner and very much invested in the people-to-people connectivity and kind of to deepen that hollow but favorable understanding of Canada. So the good news is we have a favorable image. The work ahead for all of it is to be able to deepen that understanding and fill that in a lot more. So I think your points obviously on what is happening with the global trading environment and in managing the China-US dynamics, we'll speak about that quite a bit. I'm looking forward to the fact that we will have a discussion. So without further ado, Richard, if I could call on you to come and share some initial thoughts from the Philippine perspective, both on the year that is, but also looking at the year ahead. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll keep it within 10 minutes, don't worry. Okay, well speaking of the streets, Philippines, we're going to have traffic regardless with or without summit, but I was told that likely we'll have both Xi Jinping and Trump next year, but you never know. Having said that, that's the reason why I've been making the most out of my time here in Canada. I'm basically an expert now in Canada, of course, going across the country in like 5 or 6 days. Except yesterday, the weather was not that good, and I found it actually very opportune because it gave me time to finally go back to my German readings. So I went through the Hannah Arendt and the Max Weber's work yesterday, and one of the things that really struck me was a lot of emphasis. So if you look at Arendt's on violence and Max Weber's politics as vocation, it's very interesting because uncertainty, identity, and issues like forbearance really come to the forth, right? So they're almost 50 years apart. One is in early 20th century, one is the mid-century, and now we're in the early 21st century. And you could see there common themes that I saw there that I could relate to. And speaking of forbearance, that's always what I tell our partners around the world when it comes to ASEAN. It's a very difficult thing. Obviously, when it comes to ASEAN, there's this still zoological debate. Is it a cow? Is it a horse? Thanks to Bilhari Kausikan. But my point is, we can have a long debate about that. But if you look at the history of ASEAN throughout the past half a century, it is not really monolithic. There were times that it was hyperactive during the Indo-China wars, sometimes for good, sometimes not actually for so good. We played a very proactive role during the transition of East Timor to democracy, and we did it unilaterally, in a very Frank Sinatra my way, not the multilateral consensus-based kind of approach. So. And then, of course, I'll talk about the Philippines also. We made certain unilateral actions that really favored the region. Now, speaking of ASEAN, nowadays, honestly, I gave a talk at the ASEAN Summit last year in Indonesia. Earlier this year was also another summit, 1.5 track in Malaysia. There's a lot of focus on economics. But if you read in between the lines, there's also a lot of focus about identity. This notion of the global south, rising powers. BRICS apparently is a very sexy thing. I used to think of BRICS like Bitcoin. It only works if you believe in it, right? But apparently it is working because more and more people are believing in it. In fact, more countries are lining up to join the BRICS, although I'm not sure about the concrete outcomes of that yet, which puts us Filipinos in a tough spot. Because, again, I don't speak for the Philippine government. I had a weird situation, someone from the embassy saying, he's not speaking on behalf of us, obviously, right? It's because I'm controversial, unfortunately, sometimes, but for good reason. And we call it real talk, right? In the case of the Philippines, we, at least when we talk about the strategic elite, very much feel affinity with much of the West, but also with the Americas. I mean, yesterday was the Mexico Day, right? And I would go around there and I would feel at home almost with them, right? A lot of our words, including, words like tatay, father, if I'm not mistaken, has an Aztec root, right? Because tatay is the name supporters of former President Duterte give him, right? That he's like the father of the nation, right? So for a long time, we were actually ruled via Mexico, right? Not directly through Spain until the opening Suez Canal. So, and one of the reasons why, at least we used to admire a lot Anwar was, he was a Filipinist. He was a great admirer of our Ilustrados, the nationalist Republican revolutionaries in the 19th century were actually at the forefront of anti-colonial, anti-Western efforts. The reason I'm saying all of these things is because in the Philippines, sometimes we feel we're part of the region, but also not part of the region. And it cuts both ways, right? And the othering goes both ways. Now, obviously, we Southeast Asia, one thing we have all in common is that we're very, very polite, right? And then there are people like me who say these things out loud and get into trouble. But these are the truths that you can see in behind the closed-door discussions, including reports I'm getting sometimes like, Philippines is being othered as the American deputy sheriff in ASEAN, just the same way Australians are othered, but Australians probably deserve that, but not us. We're part of the region. We're a founding member of ASEAN. And next year, we're going to take over the ASEAN in place of Myanmar. So we have to do something big. Now, speaking of the Philippines, I think one area where we can have a lot of commonality with the rest of the region, we always hear, we don't want to make choices, blah, blah, blah. But I'm saying not making choice is a choice in itself, and there are costs and benefits to that, and you have to justify it. And we felt, at least some of us in the Philippines felt, that a rules-based international order is in the benefit of everyone. Because the alternative is the rule of the jungle. The alternative is what Russia is doing to Ukraine. The alternative is what maybe China has in mind in terms of a new tributary system in our part of the world. So we always felt creating a rules-based order is something that will inherently benefit much of the region. But my understanding is that the appreciation is not there, at least to the degree that we want publicly speaking. That's why some of us came up with this notion of strategic gaslighting. So if you look at it, the Philippines since 2013 has been pushing for a rules-based approach to the South China Sea disputes, one of the most dangerous disputes out there. We took a lot of risk when we took China to international court in 2013. Yes, we had someone called Duterte, but we still held on to that arbitration case. And just a few years ago, we also launched the Transparency Initiative. The Arbitral Tribunal Award in 2013 today can be invoked by Malaysia, Brunei, and also by Vietnamese, not to mention even the Indonesians can invoke it to push back against China's expansive claims in the South China Sea. By taking that unilateral action and that risk, we have benefited everyone. In fact, today, Vietnamese fishermen could hold the arbitral award and say, oh, no, I thought the arbitral award said Scarborough Shoal is a common fishing ground, right? So therefore, we can go there. So we benefited the region by taking that unilateral action, but we didn't benefit our own national interests in terms of tensions it created in the bilateral relationship. And my sense was, that's why always China was a bit edgy also in dealing with the Duterte administration, not knowing how long this will last, for the right reasons, because Duterte was not the only veto player in Philippine foreign policy, as it turned out to be the case. We also took a lot of risk over the past 2-3 years with our transparency initiative. We're probably the only country in the region, no offense to everyone else, who's every day reporting about incidents of at least what we see is contravention of international law and bullying. And yet, the statements we get from some of our regional leaders is, for me, tantamount to gaslighting, projecting the Philippines as a troublemaker, projecting the Philippines as a lackey of the US and the West. And this, to be honest, has its own emotional lacerations. So much so that there are many elites, strategic elite in the Philippines saying, ASEAN is worse than useless, it's an enabler. I clearly disagree with that. I think we have to be understanding that when it comes to ASEAN, there are differentials in terms of economic dependency. We're not as much dependent on China, unlike a lot of our neighbors. And Indochina is a completely different picture compared to archipelagic Southeast Asia. Threat perceptions are very different. I mean, if you're Cambodia or Laos, you don't have the kind of territorial disputes that we have with China. Or definitely Cambodia, maybe Laos is a bit more complicated. And of course, capability-wise, I will completely understand if you're Malaysian, you want to be more careful about what you say and what you do, although more what you say than rather what you do, because you don't have the US Treaty Alliance backup, as imperfect as that so-called insurance policy is. I mean, obviously, our relationship with the US is complicated. The joke is maybe Marcos could have just had a Zoom call with Trump if he's just going to get 1 percentage points down. But I think we got a lot of exceptions, including also big defense aid and also healthcare aid that is coming in. Now, having said that, what are we going to expect next year? I think next year is really an amazing opportunity for us to clear some of this fog of misunderstanding or mist or whatever, and for more opportunity for us to interact, us Southeast Asian experts talking to each other. Because what we're seeing today is that there's a lot of nexus between Chinese scholars and some of our Southeast Asian scholars, and then there are all of these pesky Filipinos talking to the Western partners and feeling part of the West, right? So we want to close that gap, and we want to find some sort of a common, optimal, Goldilocks common ground where we can move forward. As I said, precisely because we are taking over from Myanmar, we have to deliver something. Earlier this year in Kuala Lumpur, I had a conversation with some of folks based in Myanmar, including very influential people, and they were telling me, interestingly, Aung San Suu Kyi could still have another renaissance, political renaissance. That the situation is such a deadlock and so hopeless that even the military folks, some of them may be open to the idea of asking her again to put something together, because it's basically a deadlock there. Unless you want to have a kind of a Syrian denouement, as we saw last year. So maybe the Philippines can revisit whether our current approach is working and how we can nudge it towards an internal solution, maybe once again through Aung San Suu Kyi. Right? It's a long conversation. I don't want to get into it, and we have better experts than me are coming later on. On the South China Sea, this is where it gets a bit tricky, because we cannot push the way we push it as a nation, because obviously we have to reflect the emerging consensus within the region. But having said that, domestic politics matters. If you're an ASEAN chairman, actually you can shape the agenda and priorities. So in 2016, when Duterte won, I predicted, I said, no, next year, Philippine ASEAN will talk rather more about terrorism and drugs rather than South China Sea. That's exactly what happened. In fact, it was weird, because when Japan, Australia, and our partners said, we have to follow international law, the UNCLOS ruling, the Philippine government would say, it is our right, basically, not to assert our right, right? So that was the weird situation we had in the ASEAN summit in 2017. So coming next year, with the current Marcos Jr. administration, there is a value to focusing on the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea issue, because this is an issue that has 80 to 90% approval rating at home. And this is one of the issues which allows President Marcos Jr. to actually score points, even among progressives and leftists, and people are not a fan of his. Because at least they feel on the foreign policy front, he's definitely much more patriotic than his predecessor, or less China-leaning. Having said that, I think there's enough dexterity with our current foreign minister, who has dealt a lot with China through bilateral consultative mechanisms, and also President Marcos, who you can Google his picture with Mao Zedong in 1975 together. He helped normalization of bilateral ties, one of the first US allies to normalize this. So I think there's a lot of dexterity and I would say nuanced diplomatic muscle there in the Philippines to find that common ground. But talking about the common ground, I mean, to be honest, I'm much more interested about ongoing negotiations and discussions with Vietnam on maritime delimitation. I think realistically, that's really the best way forward. I think if Philippines and Vietnam delimit what are the areas they claim and where the areas they overlap, and the same thing with Malaysia, although there's a such slight complication with the Sabah issue, and we can do the same thing with Brunei. Let's not forget Brunei is also a claimant state. Then that could actually make it easier for us to talk about a code of conduct. Now, I think next year what we can have on the code of conduct is a negative definitional clarification, because what we have to be clear about is what we don't want the code of conduct to be. Because for a long time we thought code of conduct should not be non-legally binding, therefore should not be just declaratory. We already have that, the Declaration of Conduct Parties in the South China Sea. And I always say, if China can create whole cities in a few years, why is it taking us 20 years to finalize the outline and title of a piece of paper? But having said that, I think what we don't want is a legally binding code of conduct that goes against the spirit of UNCLOS and goes in particular against, at least for the Philippines, against our arbitral tribunal award in 2016. Because in 2018, it was leaked that one approach was there will be a legally binding approach, but it will give China or some members of the whatever code of conduct a veto power over the participation of external powers, whether it's energy exploration or maritime security activities. We're never going to accept that. And US is not going to accept that, right? So that's the code of conduct we don't want to have. So at the very least, I think there could be some healthy discussion about an intra-ASEAN code of conduct, or at least maritime delimitation, which for me would be far more productive than all of this, oh, we just finalized the outline. We just finalized the first paragraph after 20 years or something like that, right? I think that's a healthier way forward. Now, last part, to justify this last day of my event, my expenses here. Solid middle power diplomacy. You know, if you look at the Lowy Institute's breakdown of middle powers and all, and if you look at it even quantitatively, not qualitatively, I compared the regional order in Southeast Asia to kind of like German politics. So for a long time, German politics was dominated by the SPD and Christian Democrats and CSU. So that share used to be 60 to 70% of, that's now down to 40% probably, or 45%, or even less. Yet it's still, you have two dominant parties, and then the other ones will kind of mediate how the two will be able to form a coalition or a government on their own. My sense in ASEAN is we're moving towards that, because as powerful as China and the United States are as global superpowers, the picture in Southeast Asia is much more complex. I mean, if you look at Vietnam, you look at Philippines, even Indonesia, Japan is a massive, massive source of economic investments. In fact, all the big-ticket infrastructure projects in Manila, including an incoming subway, are Japanese. Asian Development Bank is there. So you already have the factor of Japan diluting this purely binary US-China kind of approach. More than that, with the entry of our European friends, Canadians, Kiwis, India, the other rising superpower, I think it allows us, once upon a time Russia also, it allows us to diversify it, whereby, yes, you'll have two dominant power, but not as dominant as they used to be. And that creates a lot of room for maneuver. So while we do a lot of this 50 shades of hedging, the reality is that you can only do hedging when it's not a clear Cold War. And the best way to avoid a clear Cold War from coming out is avoiding it becoming a clear-cut binary competition. And that's precisely where the role of middle power comes in. And I think that's extremely why it's extremely important for you guys to be involved in all sorts of arrangements we have. Now, when it comes to Philippines, I'm almost done. You know, we're engaged in all sorts of squads, right? 4 with you guys, 4 with Australians. And my point is, again, just like Deng Xiaoping said, you know, we're crossing the river and feeling the stones, right? So let's not make any final statements or ideas about what works or what not, because this is a new era. This is new. That's why I started with Arendt and Weber, of all people, is because they were grappling, even given their intellectual firepower, with what on earth is going on. This is whether 1917 Munich or whether this is 1970 America, right? So if those intellectuals with that firepower were struggling to come to grips with reality, I think we have every right not to give final answers in these interventions, but actually open up for more deconstruction of what on earth is happening. So we had fantastic conversations here. I'm really happy with conversation in Winnipeg, Ottawa here. I mean, we talked about, I call it intersectional cooperation. In the same way, in critical theory, you have to fight oppression in terms of class, race, and gender, also in terms of security threats. Like South China Sea to us is as much maritime security as it is energy security and food security. It's impossible to separate those things. Industrial policy and strategy is as much about national security because it's about supply chain resilience, right? So with that kind of intersectionality, I think it perfectly makes sense for us to have this multi-directional and multi-line approach, and Canada offers a lot, right? The joke is you're the nicer Americans, but I'm sure you can go more than that. And the DVD, the dark vessels detection, that is a perfect example of what I call niche intervention. You find one area whereby with just a few $1 million, you can make a huge impact, as if you spend billions of dollars, which obviously you won't have as a mid-sized power. So finding those niche areas, whether it's in agricultural issues, where the Philippines and Canada are moving forward strong, maritime security, those things are very important. And I'm proud that the Philippines in many ways has become this kind of springboard nation, this kind of linchpin state for a lot of like-minded middle powers to project constructive influence and interaction in the rest of the region. On that very diplomatic and constructive note, I'll close this before I say something more controversial. Maybe later on I'll have that. Thank you very much. Looking forward.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's impossible to summarize what Richard just did in 10 minutes, from sort of German philosophy to talking about ASEAN jokes and psychology and so forth. But if you're interested in learning more, we recorded an excellent podcast at the beginning of his trip, which is available on our website. And some of the events from Winnipeg and Ottawa will also be available on the website, which go into specific details about Canada, Philippines. As Richard mentioned, Philippines can be an anchor state for Canada's engagement in the region. Already has been projects like the dark vessel detection for maritime domain awareness, which is really a small budget initiative, but has had, as Richard said, quite a bit of impact in the region. We're now also extending the same support to Taiwan, and there's discussions of potentially doing that with Vietnam and others in the region as well. And I think Richard also raises a really important point about obviously engaging with ASEAN as a whole, the 10, soon to be 11 members, but also minilaterally through these smaller arrangements. And of course, Philippines has been really remarkable at having multiple such small partnerships with India, with Japan, with Australia, with others, and hopefully Canada can enter the minilateral sphere. We haven't really been active. If you note, we're not party to any of these smaller groupings yet. So I think that's a conversation for us to have about the advantages and disadvantages, because I think in Canada, our DNA is very multilateral. We're proud multilateralists. We like working with regional organizations like ASEAN. I think centrality of ASEAN is important to us. And I think that can continue, but there is an invitation from the region to engage in strategic kind of issue-specific areas where we have something to offer, where everybody can benefit. So I think that's something for us to explore, and I hope we'll get a little bit more on that. So to build on those concrete recommendations that have already come out and to share a little bit from Canada's perspective, Kai, the floor is yours. You can also speak about German philosophy, drawing on your heritage as well. So thank you.
Thanks. Well, good morning. Bonjour à tous. It is not an easy act to follow these two, and since Vina prompted me, I'll start with a passage from Nietzsche, just to get us all on track. No, I can't do that. That takes more preparation. I didn't refresh yesterday. My job here, I think, is to provide a bit of backdrop and remind us of where we are. I think we have a lot of points of agreement on what's happening in the world, what's happening in Southeast Asia, where Canada might fit into this, but we need to keep a couple of key points in mind as we think about what this looks like in concrete terms. And as Vina started us off with, I think there are many positives to highlight since 2022 when Canada launched its Indo-Pacific strategy. Canada has been more engaged. We've shown up regularly. We've had prime minister visits. We have another one on the horizon. We've had high-level ministerial visits. We've had trade missions. We've had Canada and Asia conferences. All of this has built momentum, right? And all of this has reinforced the positive brand that Canada brings to Southeast Asia. As we've heard as well, the friendlier Americans, or whichever version of this you'd like, A country that has a less complicated past in Southeast Asia than others, a country that's seen as having a lot to offer the region, right? That said, I think we also need to remember that Canada has a lot of ground to make up. We heard reference to the IC's State of the Region survey that asks countries about influence. Typically, we focus on the competition between first and second place, China and the United States. There's also hot competition for, I believe it's 12 and 13, and that's between New Zealand and Canada. New Zealand edged out, Canada edged out New Zealand. But the point is, Canada is at this stage not a major actor in Southeast Asia. And that's a reality we have to recognize. And it's not a major actor in large part because it is seen as having been something of a fair weather friend over the last several decades. I think it's a reality we have to contend with, that comes to the region on regular occasions, makes big announcements, and often doesn't follow through, particularly when domestic political winds shift. Right? That means there is a lot of investment to do and a lot of groundwork to focus on before some of these opportunities that we've heard about can be leveraged in a really meaningful way. Right? Now, there is a lot of opportunity at the moment, of course, too. The chaos that the Trump administration has sought globally has forced virtually every country around the world to rethink many of their assumptions about the position they hold in the world, how they approach foreign policy, how they diversify trade. We're no longer in an era where the primary question on economic decisions is efficiency. We're now in an era where we're thinking about security, about reliability, right? And with the tariffs that we've seen, the United States no longer plays the anchoring role that it has for many countries around the world. There is a lot of welcome in Southeast Asia for Canada to join that fray as a clear-headed partner to help navigate that uncertainty, as a North American alternative to some extent to the United States in niche areas. And being at UBC, I see this. We have a bumper crop this year. Many of those are students internationally who want a North American education and who are uneasy with developments in the United States and have chosen Canada as a result. That's one particular area, but we can find equivalents in tech. We can find equivalents in other niche areas as well, right? On development, of course, with the gutting of USAID and a lot of other vehicles that countries around the world and in Southeast Asia have relied on, Canada, of course, does not have the size, the gravity to replace the United States, but we brought up Myanmar, for example. Canada has played a constructive role in supporting democratization and proponents of democracy in Myanmar since 2015. That's a role that it can continue to do, especially given that in the vacuum that's followed the retreat of the United States, Canada is one of the more palatable and welcome countries that can help fill that in, right? There are real challenges to all of this, aside from this backdrop. We've talked about the role that Canada can play in trade diversification. Of course, Canada's private sector cannot be told what to do. At very best, the government can facilitate diversification. It's done that effectively to some extent through the trade missions, through raising awareness. From my perspective, the ASEAN-Canada Free Trade Agreement that's being negotiated is valuable not least because it raises awareness of the opportunities across the Pacific. But the reality still is that the vast majority of Canada's private sector is oriented towards the United States. And that when we're talking about diversification, we're talking about not just raising awareness of opportunities, but fundamentally restructuring the way a lot of companies operate. And this is not something that can be done overnight. So we've heard about the importance of Canada being a, let's say, full spectrum partner to Southeast Asia, not just focused on trade and security. There is a justification to that, a why to that. And the major component to that is that Canada simply doesn't have, at this point, the dense networks and connections across Southeast Asia to realize a lot of these opportunities in their full form. That takes investment over years. It takes building people-to-people ties. I'm sure this is something that Richard and Tricia could provide many anecdotes about, as can Veena and Jeff. It's often the case that getting something done in Southeast Asia is not about looking up a government directory and finding the appropriate office and writing an email out of the blue, but rather finding a trusted confidant, talking to them, and having them facilitate. Decades of underinvestment means there are just not enough of those linkages for Canada to rely on to be the full partner that it has the opportunity to be. So what I would suggest as we look forward is that Canada enter the region with ears wide open. That's not really a thing, is it? Whatever the equivalent of the ears to the eyes is. That means listening, right? We're in a different era than we were not so long ago. And I think we've heard both Tricia and Richard reference issues like values and China and the skepticism that many in Southeast Asia hold on some of these points. Right? We have to, I think Canada has to recognize that the script it has used over the last several decades needs adjustment to the contemporary period. Right? Being seen as the United States' smaller brother, as an adjunct to the United States, as an entryway to the United States, got Canada a lot of mileage in the past. I don't think that's the case anymore. Speaking purely about values forward, maybe worked for Canada in some respects. There is a lot of skepticism about values when spoken from a Western country in at least large parts of Southeast Asia, given the conflict in the Middle East. Many in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and other parts of Southeast Asia will say, yes, the West talks about values, it adheres to values when it's in its interests. And when it's not in its interests, it simply ignores them. Right? I think being a listener on conversations like that, being a listener on the role that China plays in the region, which is varied across countries, will put Canada in a much stronger position to begin over the medium and longer term to meaningfully leverage the opportunities that we've heard about and to continue building on the momentum that we've built since 2022, because the opportunities, you started us off with that, they're immense, and we really need to keep those in the front of mind. A region of almost 700 million people, large diaspora connections in Canada, growing markets, growing middle classes. If Canada is serious about diversification, Southeast Asia almost invariably has to be an important part of that going forward. I'll end there so that we have time for enough discussion.
Thank you so much, Kai, and thank you so much also for reminding us of the need to listen more and to be humble, and of the fact that we are still struggling for strategic relevance for many of the ASEAN countries. So the survey that you mentioned, I think you're absolutely right. We're often competing for number 10 or 11 with New Zealand, with the exception of one place, and that's Philippines, where we're number 6 in terms of our strategic relevance to the elites surveyed in the Philippines. So I think that's partly why we're also positioning Philippines as a place where we have a lot more opportunity for that full spectrum engagement, not just obviously economic and trade engagement, for which there are opportunities in more places than one. So I think we are finally at a point where we can transition to the stage for all of our speakers. If I could invite you all to take a seat. And I have to note, as a moderator, and luckily my boss is in the room to remind me of this, I may have skipped the land acknowledgement, which was not at all intentional. It was very much part of my notes, but often when you kind of speak off the cuff and are jet lagged, you forget to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and we're very much grateful to the Indigenous people in Canada for their stewardship of the lands on which we live, work, framework in place. So that was definitely an oversight on my part, but we're absolutely thrilled to be welcoming again such a good audience in person for this discussion. My original idea was that we will have sort of another half an hour where I get to ask questions of our panelists, but I'm recognizing the time, and I really want to hear from all of you guys. So maybe I'll just pose one question so that you can start preparing yours in the meantime for all of the speakers, and that's to try to tease out a little bit more concrete ideas. So a number of you have already mentioned the opportunities and the things that we should do, so maybe if I could get you to very specifically maybe note one or two things that Canada should stop doing as part of its next 5-year action plan with ASEAN. So the things that Kai, you alluded to towards the end of your presentation in terms of maybe we should be speaking less about certain things and certainly the kind of the lecturing or the prioritization of issues. So one or two things we maybe no longer need to do that used to be part of our action plan but doesn't need to be. What we should be doubling down on and continuing. So a couple of things that have done well, like the DVDs, but others you can mention. And then maybe one or two things that should be new, that should be part of our next 5-year action plan, either with all of ASEAN's or certainly with enough forward-leaning member states. So that was not part of our prearranged discussion, but I think that could be a nice way for us to do a round before we open up the floor. So anyone who wants to start? Kai is being volunteered, so Kai, you're starting.
I just said everything I know. This is a problem. So let me begin by saying I think the things that we don't need to continue doing, there's general awareness of what has not resonated so strongly. I'm going to focus on what we should do a little bit more of, I think. And let me just get into specifics because I don't think I did sufficiently a moment ago. I couldn't agree more with Richard on the need to find niche areas. I made the rounds between starting in Manila, then Jakarta, then Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, and Singapore last year. In every spot I stopped at, DVD collaboration was amongst the top items referenced. In the Philippines, it was clear how much goodwill it had generated. It was clear how much of a demonstration it was that Canada is a valuable partner and can be a valuable partner to the region. In Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, the question immediately was, is there access to this for us? Right? Obviously, expanding that program would be valuable, but I think it's just as valuable to look for other niche areas that have a similar impact, right? And I think there are obvious areas to look. Canada is seen as a leader in AI. It's seen as a leader in elements of non-traditional security that are a real need in the region. As part of adjusting the narrative, I think it's key that Canada recognizes talking first and foremost about a third frigate in Southeast Asia or in the Indo-Pacific is not going to resonate strongly with every partner, but instead talking about what it can do on collaborating on AI, on scams, on other forms of transnational crime. Those are real areas of opportunity.
Great, thank you so much, Kai. And I think on the areas that you mentioned, certainly on cybersecurity, we should mention BlackBerry Center of Excellence that's based in Malaysia as an important partnership that's now on its way. And I think there's a desire to see if other countries in Southeast Asia could also benefit from that. So, and obviously on AI and quantum research, I think that is definitely something that's of interest in addition to looking at digital economy, powering of digital economy, so kind of linking our traditional strength around energy security, but going into the kind of the current powering of digital economy conversations that are happening. And I'm happy to note that obviously through our ABAC work, the APAC Business Advisory Council, that's some of the work that APFC is doing, but also Canada has been doing. So again, for folks who are interested, there are stuff to look at there. Tricia?
Thank you. And this is great. I will talk about 3 things. So the first one is just on the back of what has just been said around AI. I'm not sure if many of you know, but Southeast Asia is actually a huge hub for cyber crimes. This operates out of many centers, Malaysia included, and there's been a lot of great research being done right now around cybercrime and fraud. And people are recruited into these without necessarily knowing what they're getting into. Throughout Indochina, actually, it's a thriving business. So governments are actually caught off guard, again, not knowing how to govern this, what kind of laws are needed. And I see the private sector, again, trying to come in and negotiate with government and create new laws. I don't think we've seen very much intervention from actors in Canada. I mean, I may not be aware, but just to recognize that it's an ongoing thing that many governments are grappling with. So that's the first. The second thing was to think also about this idea of foundations. So the foundation that works here, that APF does, I think most of the work is around trade at the moment. But when the USAID was torn apart, it's not just USAID. There was a whole group of other foundations that have been funding great work by think tanks and civil society across Southeast Asia around issues of democracy, on governance, on reforms, research on accountability, everything that we believe liberal democracy stands for. And as Southeast Asia sees the collapse of what it sees as liberal democracy in the US, there hasn't been a replacement for that. So things around business and trade, I believe, will always continue, but I would say investing into democracy and governance kind of work, that actually builds your resilient communities within Southeast Asia. And there's a huge gap at the moment because funds have completely collapsed in the US, not just US, but Europe as well, Germany, the UK, everyone's turning to security. So if there is an opportunity for Canada, I mean, maybe that would be a second area because you build resilience in communities, and these communities are what help to then contribute as well to trade. And the third area would be in higher education. So, I mean, of course, Kai is at UBC. I'm actually at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia, and there are so many opportunities to do exchanges, to start them young as well, to create good impressions while they're at university. And these links actually do continue for life. I mean, the US has had a state-led initiative for many years, and this is where Canada could certainly follow suit as well. So fellowships, scholarships, but thinking more deeply about what kinds of scholarships that it wants to fund, and ideally funding the scholarships that are going to allow you to emphasize the values that you were talking about. What kind of values do you want people to have, and how do you build these relationships over a long-term period rather than just over a short term? Thank you.
That's great, Trisha, and I just want to underscore that last point about universities and scholarships. Obviously, Canada has had a seed scholarship, which is dedicated to Southeast Asia since 2017, but there's a lot of conversation now about being able to potentially revise and reform that. We're hearing lots of voices, and I'd obviously welcome yours as well on this, that the scholarship as it's currently designed is for 4 months, so it's not a degree program, and it allows only people to come and do short-term 4 months research. And instead of sort of giving out 200 scholarships like that a year, which is I think the current rate, there's a lot of talk on the ground that maybe reducing the 200 4-month scholarships to maybe 20 or 30 actual degree scholarships that are done in areas of interest, so be that on AI or quantum or maritime domain awareness, could really go a much longer way. So this is also something for us in Canada to not necessarily, we don't need to always increase the funding envelope, it's just reprioritizing so that instead of kind of having this sprinkler where we give a little bit to many, we actually invest in certain specific things that are done as part of the kind of our overall approach to the region. So I think that's one thing that we can have discussions, and I know folks in the room may know something about that as well. And then of course your point about the fact that there's now a huge vacuum with the US and others pulling out from the development assistance, which looks at governance, human rights, and all those issues. What would that look like for Canada, given our own discussions and debate about streamlining potentially, right, and cutting and so forth? So I think it's a discussion also to have with folks in the room who know a little bit the thinking of what's happening to our development assistance and aid budget as well. Richard, you've had plenty of time to think, so things that we should not do.
I almost forgot what I was supposed to say. Very interesting intervention. Well, what are the no's, right? I mean, first of all, one of the things I always tell our traditional partners is that don't be timid So half jokingly, I tell our Japanese friends, be more Italian, right? And I don't mean it in terms of Italian infrastructure per se, although I'm a big fan of Italian historical infrastructure. But I tell the Japanese, you're investing billions and billions already in the Philippines. So you need to get more bang out of that buck you're already putting here, which is in stark contrast to our communist friends in Beijing who actually have a lot of pledges, and it's more like a pledge trap than an actual investments, right? But they get a lot of traction. They get a lot of algorithmic resonance because they're good in making these statements. Oh, we signed this agreement, that agreement. But, you know, few people bother to really follow through. Was that an MOU? Was it an MOA? Did it really push through? Like, we can talk about the BR projects forever. So my thing is, like, if you have done something well, including a niche thing that really made an impact, I'm not saying be shameless. You don't have to say it's the greatest thing in the world, but you can say at the very least, it's, you know, it made a lot of. So don't be timid. That's number one, right? I said you're nice Americans, but you know there are things we can learn from our American friends in terms of salesmanship, not hard sell, but salesmanship. The number two thing, and this is really applies to my country, Philippines, is don't treat us as your sources of your nurses and doctors because we need them also back here. And I know you're trying to be polite around it sometimes, but it still comes off, right? So, labor export has been a way for elite to shortchange their responsibility to the country for far too long. We have to fix that. What I'm more interested in is if we can work together to really help the coherence of the million-strong Filipino-Canadian community here. And I always make this argument when I'm in the U.S. We're even bigger than the Vietnamese or the Indian-American community, and yet if you look at our lobbying power, the coherence, the two-way business and engagements, I think we have a lot of job to do in America. I'm not as familiar with the Canadian community, and that's why I look forward to the Filipino-Canadian communities also inputs, but my sense is that's a lot of multiplier effect we can have. If we can make this sector, how I wish, more and more Filipinos who make it good here, and I'm happy for them to bring back some of that investments in the Philippines based on the expertise and technologies you have here. If you're in Montreal, maybe software AI. If you're Winnipeg, maybe in agriculture and energy. If you're, I'm now an expert in Canada. If you're here in Ottawa, right? It could be also in the healthcare sector where the Philippines has huge gaps. So I kind of feel weird when I go to, let's say, London or down under or down under, say, oh, fantastic nurses. Good, you're enjoying them because we need them back home. We're going to be also an aging society, after a certain period, right? And we have serious social safety nets issues. Last point, and I think this is even more controversial. It's a bit more ideational and regional. I mean, Hillary Clinton, one of the good things she said in terms of her reflection on the disaster of 2016 elections was, you have to meet voters where they are. So that's also what I say to our Western partners, and this debate came up when Germany had also an active feminist foreign policy like you guys. I'm all for that. I'm all for having more inclusivity, 100%. But when you go to a region whereby illiberalism is a default option, right, including in the Philippines increasingly, the sole liberal democratic nation, I would say, then you have to you have to push for values in a language, in a lexicon that resonates, right? Otherwise, you're asking for, some sort of backlash. I mean, I don't have to talk about that. It will be a long conversation. So my point is a little bit, so I know into your domestic audiences it looks great, but you have to meet ASEAN where it is. And much of ASEAN is basically illiberal populist, to be honest, whether it's democratic or the other variations of the regimes we have. And I think that's where you can push things forward. My suggestion is always that rules-based order is the best way because a rules-based order is good for all smaller and mid-sized powers, right? If you can peg whatever values you push to that, then that perfectly, I think, plays into the hedging culture we have in Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. And
There's no punchline. I'm not going to quote Gramsci, but as I always say, optimism of the spirit, pessimism of the mind, right? So it's very important.
Can I just respond to the one point about the rules-based order? So I think there's a lot of talk about rules-based order here, and because, and I know this may not be front and center here, but it is front and center at least in Malaysia and Indonesia. Where you have a lot of the populations who see that players are not so you play according to the rules. I think it was mentioned by one of the panelists when the rules suit you. So if you are going to embark on this whole rules-based order initiative, we have to be also very careful, right, about which rules is it that you're adhering to, and in other instances, which rules are you not adhering to? And I'm referring to the Middle East. So again, that's front and center where we come from.
We can always count on Richard to speak his mind and to say the things that maybe all of you were alluding to but didn't quite put on the table. So that is fantastic. But of course, the message about telling our success stories very much resonates. I think we do have to be better at telling the story when something actually has gone well. So you have all been extremely patient. Thank you so much for that. So we do have mics around the room. I will say let's collect 3 comments or questions, and then we'll turn to the panel. So I see John's hand there in the back. Excellent. So we have our first round already identified. John, you have the floor.
Thank you. I agree with you that the small, beautiful DVD using the American language is where Canada should be going, but that's not my question. If the FTA agreement with that, do you have any comments on where that is, why it's taking almost 10 years, and what the obstacles are?
Great FTA agreement. I will keep that, and then we'll take, gentleman here at the back, middle, sorry. And please identify yourself. Apologies for not recognizing everyone.
Good morning, everyone. Hello? Yeah, Sid Mehta, founder of Greenworks. I had a question around agriculture and food. You all have been through the West Coast. You okay? No? Okay,
Yes.
there you go now. The question is around what is the opportunity for Canada to play a critical role in food security, especially as the aging population in ASEAN and the middle class. So it's like a double opportunity. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Philippe. I'm a student of international relations. So the West is looking to friendshore its supply chains. So, for example, rare earth minerals. Now, I know the Malaysia is planning to build an integrated rare earth supply chain. And Pahang is the largest refining plant outside of China. So my question is, how do you compete against the subsidies by the Chinese government? Because China's playbook since the 1980s was to start a price war and then outlast its competitors with state tax cuts and subsidies. And I doubt that governments around the world is keen on entering a fight of who could lose the most money with China.
Great. Thank you so much. 3 excellent questions. So FTA, food and agriculture, and critical mineral supply chains, which I think is really relevant, obviously, for Canada as well, and sort of how do we compete with China. Anybody wants to take all of them? Kai, why don't you start us off?
I'll say I don't have any specific up-to-date insights on the status of the FTA, but it's important to keep a number of things in mind. The first is that when we talk about ASEAN as a market, it's an extraordinarily diverse market, right? With some of the world's most advanced economies all the way through to some of the world's least. And that creates challenges for any coherent framework. Those are compounded by the priority that Canada's placed on Richard, you put it so nicely, I won't say much more about that, on values that are difficult to map onto realities in parts of Southeast Asia as well. I think there's progress. I think it's clear to everybody that having this done is better than having it be perpetually in the works. It may end up being a bit less powerful than was originally hoped by some, but as I said, I think a big part of the objective is to raise awareness of opportunity, and it will achieve that regardless of all the minute details in it.
I won't respond to the FTA one. I don't know enough about that. I'll talk about the food security issue. So I think not just Canada, and I've been hearing this from friends here about the cost of food increases. It's happening around the world, and we all experienced that post-COVID and as well as after the Russia-Ukraine war. In Malaysia, we're also, and I'm speaking just on Malaysia, experiencing that, and the government actually has just introduced an increased sales and service tax on food items, which actually is testing the food security domestically, because you're actually taxing the so-called luxury goods, which are actually healthier for the population. So there's a lot of debate around, why are you actually taxing things that are healthier? And so we have a stunting and obesity problem at the same time, because the lower income groups are essentially eating cheap, unhealthy food. I think this is where, if Canada's suppliers can make use of the FTAs, so actively looking at specific FTAs, whether it's the CPTPP, whether it's the upcoming ASEAN-Canada FTA, specific clauses that will allow certain types of food, especially halal, right? That would, like I mentioned earlier, would really make it more palatable. And on that count, I also know the constraints that countries face with regards to halal. I mean, I've spoken to other exporters from around the world, like in Brazil, for example, where some of the requirements are actually quite ridiculous. And this is why the US was trying to negotiate down these requirements on Malaysia's side, right? So for example, I don't know, putting up, constructing prayer rooms when there are actually no employees who are Muslim, but it's part of the inclusivity thing. So the looking at the types of foods that will actually help with Malaysia's aging society, you mentioned, in a healthier way, I think would already be of great benefit, because we don't want to see our children just consuming extremely cheap, unhealthy goods, and it's also a problem for our long-term medical expenses, to be honest. On the critical minerals and the diversification of supply chains, I think that's precisely the concern. So the concern is that will Southeast Asian nations be able to compete with the vast sectors of the economy of China that are providing these heavy subsidies and so on. So again, on the one hand, you have to project, so Southeast Asian countries have to project that we want to cooperate with China with these supply chains. And by the way, rare earth is also, Malaysia will be providing rare earth to China, and that's how the industry has flourished as well, on the one hand, but on the other hand, also competing with the other countries. I don't really have an answer to that. I think we have to balance, play this balancing act, and that's why, I talked about these countries looking at anti-dumping laws, but at the same time having to create these supply chains. So it's an ongoing discussion, and honestly, I think the governments are simply not sure what to do. I mean, if you talk to the Ministry of Trade in Malaysia, they will say, "Oh, why don't you give me ideas about what to do?" Thank you.
Just on that point, before Richard, you mentioned the critical minerals. I think it's an area where Canada is also trying to do a lot through the G7. And the point that you're mentioning in terms of how do we compete given the sort of the subsidies and the low pricing, well, there are lots of tools and ideas now, including minimum pricing. But the point there is that it can only happen if there's coordination among countries that are willing to do that. No country can compete with China alone. You need economies of scale. So it's how many can you bring in? Whether there are parts, so the case of Malaysia, obviously it's already a partnership between Japan, Australia, and Malaysia, right? In terms of the refining capacity that's already there, which is the largest outside of China, right? So can we learn from that, and can we actually expand that, and can we bring in the tools that are people introducing, like in Australia, as well as here in Canada, but to do so in a coordinated way, so that we're not competing with each other, but rather we're trying to pull together to be able to compete and protect the industries that are flourishing here. For those who are interested in this topic, we did a wonderful public event like this on September 4th, dedicated exclusively to critical minerals conversation with experts on the subject. That video is available online, so you can listen to kind of 90-minute conversation on what should we be doing on critical mineral supply chains. So, and then on the FTA, since both Kai and Trisha mentioned that there are issues there, but we don't know what they are. I think what's relevant to think about is the kind of the lessons that we've learned from the Indonesia CIPA, the comprehensive agreement that was signed with Indonesia. What elements of that can help us expedite discussions with ASEAN? And I think the point that Kai made, that the kind of the comprehensive progressive elements of it may need to be reduced, or at least the expectations of that may need to be reduced to be able to get it through the finish line, and that's something that we would consider. But the basic point on all FTAs is, I think, the one that Atrisha, you mentioned earlier about utilization. We have CPTPP already in the region, which allows us free trade with a number of ASEAN countries, certainly Malaysia, Brunei, Singapore, and Vietnam. But we're seeing that utilization of CPTPP is really still quite low. About 15% of businesses are using them. So especially SMEs, which are the backbone both of Canadian and Southeast Asian economies. So there's a lot of scope for organizations to be able to build capacity so that there is a lot more utilization and an understanding of why these FTAs even matter. So I think it's good that we have FTAs and it's good that we're negotiating others, but we have to be realistic that utilization is still an issue, as particularly for SMEs. Richard.
Well, very quickly, let me just go back to also an important point there before I answer some of the questions. I mean, I'm very much in the negation of the negation thing, right? Like, I'm all for this questioning of the rules-based international order as if it's like the Holy Roman Empire, right? Neither holy nor Roman. I mean, it was Austrian, and it was not really an empire, right? So we can clearly say whose rules, which international community. So the double standards people keep on mentioning when it comes to Gaza conflict in parts of Southeast Asia is something that, you know, this is a serious conversation. I mean, this is something that is close to the heart of the political elite. You just don't have to listen to Anwar or Prabowo, etc. Even in Thailand, in Singapore, you see those kinds of conversations. These are fraught, difficult issues, right? So my point is much more aspirational and at the same time contested. You have to push for a rules-based order that properly reflects not only the existing and emerging balance of power, but also the values and principles that a lot of us outside the West embody, including us Filipinos, right? So that is an ongoing debate, and we had a very interesting discussion with the Philippine Foreign Ministry earlier this year on that. And this is a debate, we're gonna have more of that, and it's very important. Now, going to the free trade issue, absolutely the utilization issue is very important. We had that discussion earlier. Canadian companies, a lot of them, are they even, I mean, is there even the threshold for them to go through the legalist expenditures, etc.? But what I'm seeing right now, and I was in Brussels also earlier this year, a lot of visits to European partners. So they finalized with Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand could be next. So I think the Europeans are really doubling down on this kind of middle powers, basically non-US China people coming in. But the reality is that, and this is where I have agreements with the Trump people, is that the free trade agreements are great if you are from a position of strength, right? And the reality is that we can talk about all of this, and this is the criticism I have of a lot of ASEAN partners. They always talk about our trade with China expanded, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but it's a very one-way street, right? It's one road, one way, right? The high-tech stuff comes from them. They dominate the supply chain. We're running more and more trade deficit with them. So it's a very one-way relationship, to be honest. We have so much deindustrialization. In Southeast Asia, in the 80s, we were making a lot of products that China will make in 2000s. And now that we're trying to pick up the pieces, China is already moving towards the most high-end technologies and still dominating that. So negation of negation. Go on, be my guest, criticize the West all you can, but if you're going to be quiet on the China side of how this free trade situation with China is not really as mutual and reciprocal, then I'll respect you. This is the problem I have. It's always this kind of one-way criticism. It has to be a negation of negation. So industrial policy is absolutely important. I saw a lot of bashing of Indonesia when Jokowi pushed for more processing of the minerals. But I mean, the idea that Southeast Asia will be just either dumping side of toxic materials or where, like low processed stuff will come in, we should be past that, right? We're looking at countries who are serious about moving up the supply chain. And I think, Philippines, for instance, we're positioning ourselves as a China-free supply chain partner, particularly on nickel and other critical minerals. We want to have more say on the processing. So it has to be kind of a mutually capacitating relationship. And to be honest, it's always easier to get that when your partner is not a superpower. I don't care what color, what creed, what background. That's just balance of power situation in any negotiation that any serious negotiator will tell you. Richard, it's fantastic to have all of these Hegelian dialectics there, but when you sit down across a superpower country, the dynamics is completely different, right? I don't care if it's Beijing or Washington or whatever, which thankfully we're not getting with Europeans who, by the way, collectively are now the second largest economy, again, ahead of China. But they don't act that way sometimes, which is a good thing. Last one on the agricultural issue, I mean, this keeps on coming up. Again, I'm boasting how I read your papers. If you look at your Indo-Pacific papers, like Philippines was identified already during the pandemic as a most food insecure nation in Southeast Asia, fast-growing middle class, fast-growing population. But basically our staple food, which is rice, 90% comes from Vietnam. I mean, I love Vietnam, I love their food, but I don't want to be dependent on any country for 90% of my staple food. One of the things Canada can do is, obviously you're not a rice exporting country, maybe you can help us to go towards a more physiologically healthy and ecologically healthy staple food. Because if you do a proper anthropological study, rice was not a staple food in the Philippines until the Green Revolution and the policies of the Marcos Sr. administration. We can have a long conversation about that. I'm all for authenticity and tradition, but do your research first, right? So maybe Canada, and this is a conversation we had in Winnipeg, among others, could help us to diversify our grain production and make it a healthier staple food. And again, it's not about just importing from you guys. We have billion-dollar conglomerates who can be involved here, and it could go the other way in terms of more cooperation between the UP Los Baños International Rice Institute. These are world-class Academy of Sciences, and our counterparts here. We have expertise, we can work together, but you need the corporate and policy muscles to create the conditions for that, to change the political economy, because the rice situation in the Philippines is just crazy. The hoarders and the middlemen and so much mafioso stuff is going on there, right? And so much diabetes and so much bad stuff also. Like, you want to fix that, right? So less extra rice, more diversification of cereal and I think that's where Canada can easily come in. So honestly, secretly, I'm doing a food diplomacy test here to see if I'm going to talk to my friends back in Manila.
Great, thank you so much. I know there are more questions in the room, but since we're almost at time, and I noticed Trisha and Kai, you were taking some notes, if there's something that you want to add sort of as final words into the conversation before we wrap up, maybe I'll do that. And again, apologies for the questions that may remain in the room. We'll have a few minutes to network afterwards. So, Kai?
Thanks. I just want to pick up on something that Richard said as well about the rules-based international order and what that means. There are points on which Canada and many countries in Southeast Asia are in full agreement on what to strive for, and that is territorial integrity, right? And also, broadly speaking, making the world safer for middle and smaller sized countries, right? And that means building an infrastructure that limits the amount of pressure, coercion that larger countries, whether it's China or the United States, are able to exert on countries. And I think as Canada considers or reconsiders its script in Southeast Asia, it's important to remember that like-mindedness means many things. Like-mindedness can be like-mindedness of values, but it could also mean like-mindedness of a recognition of geopolitical realities. And on that front, Canada is very similar to most countries in Southeast Asia as not being large enough, rich enough, powerful enough to change geopolitics, but needing to navigate them, in the larger collective where possible.
Oh, I just wanted to say that we shouldn't feel that bad about the low utilization rates, because I think the research shows that FTAs generally, like in the universe of FTAs, have a really low utilization rate. I think it's like, less than 10% or something like that. I mean, but that doesn't mean that we should not mean, that does not mean that we should not do more work to utilize them. I mean, people spend so much time negotiating them. We should make more use of them. The second thing I wanted to say was that, in terms of China's goods flooding the market and so on, we have seen effects of this happening already, right? Even before this, things like in the solar panel industry, garments, steel in Southeast Asia, these are things that are already happening. But I think what Southeast Asia would like to do is to get our industries to be more highly complex so that we're not just seen as the cheap labor center of the world. And what that means is, I think, to have countries like Canada help us go up the value chain. So complexity, no matter which sector. And again, final thing on rules-based, I think everyone keeps coming back to this. I just wanted to respond to how, the other ASEAN nations, especially around the issue of South China Sea, are not seen as engaging as much on the issue. Well, both Richard and I were on the same panel in Manila in May, and there's another one coming up in November around specifically South China Sea. And I think that will be interesting. There will be presence of both China and the US, if I'm not mistaken, there in the Manila dialogue. What the Philippines can do in the coming year to get other ASEAN nations interested on South China Sea and territorial dispute issues is to also take a greater interest in the things that the other ASEAN nations care about. So what do the naval sea area countries care about? They care about Myanmar. They care about, of course, China and tariffs, which the Philippines is also facing. But I would say appreciate the concerns and the challenges that countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Western ASEAN nations care about. And then there could be some more reciprocal caring with regards to South China Sea. But I look forward to seeing what happens next year. Thank you.
It's really difficult to try to answer all your questions and also the topic that we chose for the day, because the stuff that's coming out in your answers around industrial strategy, industrial policy, how do we deal with China, the kind of the trade imbalances, those are also very topical for Canadians right now as we're trying to reimagine our Indo-Pacific strategy, which had a big section obviously on China, but also on the region. But I think what maybe would be useful for everybody is to consider how much we need to be in conversation with each other to understand the realities in Southeast Asia when it comes to supply chains and integration with China, where there are commonalities, convergences, in terms of the overall goal to not become deindustrialized, right? So I mean, I think that's something that in Southeast Asia you were alert to even before we started talking about overcapacity and all of those issues here in North America. So I think another area where there could be strategic discussions between our leaders and leaders in the region come October is kind of what does the China challenge looks like now, right? So not from a US perspective, not necessarily from a kind of a balance of power perspective, but actually when it comes to countries' own national interests, industrial strategy, and industrial policies, and how they want to continue to compete in the economic areas of the 21st century, right? So in the same way that China wants to obviously develop, so do others. And I think that's an area where there's a lot more to explore, so maybe we'll have future conversations on that topic. I'm not going to try to summarize this discussion. It's been so rich, and it's been amazing to have Philippines and Malaysia speaking both as ASEAN representatives, but also individual national capacity. And Kai, you're terrific. But to maybe do a little bit of a thank you in closing, I will invite Jeff Nankivel, our CEO, to say a word of thanks if I can.
So very, very tough acts to follow. Hi everybody, bonjour. Bonjour à nos téléspectateurs francophones et outre. This is what we live for here at the Foundation. It's been such a great session. Like Veena, I will not try to summarize to any extent what's been said. A couple of threads to pull forward, I think, in the work that we do. You'll see we really are trying to keep a very practical focus on these discussions, and we always have to start from a sound philosophical base. But we see our role at APF Canada as being how quickly can we get down to the practical? And I'm so grateful to our panelists and to Veena for bringing us a very practical discussion. I think to put that in the context of other things, the larger picture of what we are doing with partners across Canada and across the Indo-Pacific region. Tricia, when you mentioned the kind of hollow image of Canada, it sounds quite harsh when we say it that way, but the idea that Canada has a good reputation and that people in the region, and we're talking today about Southeast Asia, are very favorably disposed towards Canada and Canadians, but they just don't know enough. This is a fantastic challenge for us because it is a totally addressable problem, and that's what we're here to do. The idea, Kai, that you raised of how important it is to be a listener. Yes, I mean, this is really at the heart of what we are doing, especially with the new resources that we have at our disposal this year and for the next few years. We have been bringing voices at APF Canada. We've been bringing voices from the region to the attention of Canadians for more than 40 years. But we are now in a position with a 5-year grant from the Government of Canada through its Indo-Pacific strategy to really have a step change in the way that we can do that. And you're seeing the fruits of that on the stage today with the fact that we are able to bring people like Richard and Tricia, from the region, so that we can all listen to them. And I'm so grateful to them for having made the trip, and I'm grateful in advance for the other things that we're doing, because Tricia's coming back very shortly to join us in Ottawa. And the message for Canadians not to be timid is one that we are really trying to shout from the rooftops. No, don't stop telling us that. We can't hear it enough, and we can't say it enough. I think the message that when we talk about things like agri-food, which will be one of the major focuses along with energy security and infrastructure at our Canada and Asia conference in Singapore next February, 9th to 11th, that it's, we get preoccupied with thinking about goods and commodities, but the potential, the billion-dollar companies in the Philippines, in Malaysia, in Thailand, Singapore, elsewhere in the region, who are looking for very high-value technology and services from Canadians. This is something, there is huge untapped potential there. When you mentioned, Tricia, also the collapse of the USAID supported ecosystem of NGOs and institutions right across Asia, this is something that I think the fallout effects of that are really starting to ripple, like the waves coming out of a tsunami. Canadian players in development assistance in Asia are seeing this, where in some cases their partners, because of their reliance on American funding, are finding themselves in bankruptcy, and the Canadians are powerless to prevent that. This is something that is going to have ripple effects, and it brings me to the point about governance. Governance is absolutely fundamental to sustainable development and to prosperity, and it's really important. And we can get all tied up in terminology around democracy and what that means, and rules-based order, what that means. But I think with ASEAN and with partners in Southeast Asia, we can find common cause when we talk about good governance, about corporate governance, about public governance, community governance. And these are areas where Canada has a strong reputation. And if we approach it as listeners and as partners, we can really make an incredible difference. And finally, Southeast Asia, when we talk about ASEAN centrality, for us at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, we make no apologies for the very strong focus that we have developed over the last few years, particularly on Southeast Asia as the part of the Indo-Pacific region where Canada is least well known and understood, where that is also least familiar to Canadians. We have located our office, our Asia regional office in Singapore. It's now up and running. I invite you to visit if you get the chance to be in the region. And we're doubling down on this focus, and you'll be hearing more from us about Southeast Asia, where there is just so much for us to be doing. And there is so much more than trade and investment to talk about here. I hope you took that from the discussions. It's a message that we want to get out to everybody in Canada. If you look back at the Indo-Pacific Strategy, Volume 1 of Canada, that's now being refreshed, to look at Southeast Asia, mainly in terms of trade and investment from a Canadian perspective, is to miss the larger plot. That even for the things we want to achieve in trade and investment, if we don't have more comprehensive partnerships, if we aren't seen as a more broadly based partner, we won't even succeed in those areas, and we'd be missing a huge opportunity and necessity for the prosperity and the well-being of Canadians to build the kind of world that we want for our children and grandchildren, if we are not more comprehensive partners, and we're really leaning in on that in our programs. I'm very grateful for everyone who has stayed with us online. To those of you in the audience, our distinguished guests, our Consuls General, Senator Austin, and others, thank you so much for being with us. You've had a chance already to applaud the three of the people on the stage, and you will again in a moment, but I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Veena and her team who are around the room, and please meet them while you're here. You're just getting a glimpse of the amazing things that are being done by Vina and her team here and across the region, strategic dialogues and roundtables, a conference coming up in Ottawa in a couple of weeks, and many other things to come in the new year. And it's really been such an exciting time for us, and we have so much to look forward to. Alors, j'aimerais vous remercier tous et toutes. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Please have a look at our website. The things we've been talking about are amply represented there: food security, cybersecurity, AI, cyber governance, and agri-food technology. All of these things, critical minerals. Do have a look at the session that was held here just a couple of weeks ago. And subscribe to Asia Watch, and once a week we'll show up in your inbox to point you at the latest things, because there's something new every couple of days. There's something new and exciting on the website. And come to our conference in Singapore in February at the Canada and Asia Conference. And with that, thank you for your forbearance with me, and on behalf of our whole team and all of you, let me thank once again, just such a terrific job, and we really appreciate all three of you taking the time to be with us, and we look forward to many such conversations in the future. Thank you to our panelists. Merci.